The Labour Party will be Australia's downfall. At least that's what the Liberal National Party is claiming. Anthony Albanese assumed office in 2022, becoming the 31st Prime Minister in Australia's history. He was up against the LNP's Scott Morrison, the 30th Prime Minister, up for re-election. One of the first things Anthony promised when he was sworn in was to pave the way forward for Australians. He claimed that he had ideas and plans that would revolutionize the Australian economy. The press called it Albonomics. The LNP called it a sham. Major parties are refusing to cooperate, and without a compromise or a way forward, political instability has taken over the Australian landscape. It's an all-too-familiar feeling when the incumbent government isn't getting along with the opposition. But things are different this time. Australians are struggling more than ever. Is there an end in sight? Or will the political parties continue to bicker without coming up with any real solution? That's what we're here to find out. Is Anthony Albanese killing small businesses in Australia? If you believe what Susan Ley, leader of the opposition, has to say, then yes, he is. Albanese's Labour Party won against Ley's incumbent Liberal National in the 2022 election, assuming office on May 23, 2022. Labour supporters would tell you to take what Ley has to say with a grain of salt. She is the leader of the opposition, after all. However, in a broader sense, Ley's criticism of Albanese's economic promises should be studied. Did you know that the Sydney Herald came up with a name for the 31st Prime Minister's economic goals? Simply, Albonomics. Albonomics had humble origins. During a press conference in April 2022, the future Prime Minister was asked about the unemployment rate in Australia. Otherwise, something a political candidate who's promising to change the face of Australia in his premiership should know. Anthony did not.
What I was not going to enter into as an option in terms of the Tasmanian unemployment rate and the various rates that are put forward. I'm happy to know that the last time I filled up, petrol was $2.20. I know how much the price of bread is. I know how much a litre of milk is. I know about those things that affect ordinary people. I'm happy to engage with you, but I'm not. It's up to people to ask whatever questions they want. Andrew.
What's the national unemployment rate?
National unemployment rate at the moment is, I think it's 5.4. Sorry, I'm not sure what it is. Yeah.
Mr. Albanese, can we ask Senator Gallagher, your shadow finance minister, some questions?
Sure.
What made Anthony's slip-up even more humiliating was the fact that he claimed he was someone the people could look up to. Previously, premiership candidates were accused of being out of touch, some unable to correctly guess the price of bread. Anthony very boldly claimed that he knew the prices for common everyday items, restating that he was aware of the impact inflation had on the country. However, he stated that the unemployment rate in Australia was 5.9 something. Anthony was off by 2%. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, unemployment in April 2022 was 3.9%, a figure his political rival and the former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, knew offhand. To his credit, Anthony accepted that this was a figure he should have known and apologized to the masses. Later on, during a political campaign in Gladstone, Anthony clutched a $1 coin in his fingers and presented his new political strategy, Albonomics. Essentially, he claimed that the hourly rate of low-paid Australian workers would go up by this much, $1 at the very least. Anthony's rebranding worked, and his apology was promptly accepted. When the 2022 election results were read, the Labour Party had won. Anthony Albanese became the 31st Prime Minister of Australia. But now we come back to Ley and how she views Anthony's premiership. More importantly, how has he fared as someone who claimed he would redefine the Australian economy for the better? According to Ley, he's done the opposite. Part of Albonomics was to reduce fuel prices and increase hourly rates for Australian labourers. Ley claimed that Anthony had done neither. She backed her statements with cold, hard evidence, presented by the Australian insolvency statistics that stated debt repayments across construction sectors in Australia had been inadequate. Insolvencies had gone up since Anthony assumed office. Besides the manufacturing and construction sectors struggling to get by, small business owners had more or less given up. According to Ley, who backed up her claims with data from the Business Risk Index, Australian small businesses have about 12 more months before they officially shut down. This again would be because of Anthony's inability to deliver on the promises he made when he assumed office. Lay also referenced the fuel crisis, claiming that small businesses are facing a worse crisis than they did during the COVID-19 pandemic. To the opposition leader's credit, she also offered a solution, allocating a portion of the federal budget to Australian small-sized and medium-sized businesses. However, she believed that the Labour Party was too focused on chasing ambitious endeavours to actually sit down and focus on the common citizen. That ambitious endeavour would be the future Made in Australia policy. In 2024, the Labour Party committed an additional $22.7 billion for the proposal, which already included $13.7 billion of corporate welfare and $15 billion for the National Reconstruction Fund. At the time of Lay's writing in 2024, the policy was yet to take effect. What is the policy that Lay seemed highly critical of? To better understand the criticism, we have to first explain the policy. And what better resource than Anthony Albanese's website itself? The Future Made in Australia policy draws on a key aspect of Albonomics, that is, to make use of the natural and human resources available in the nation. The primary goals of the policy include reducing Australia's net emission to zero by 2050, making it a country that runs wholly on renewable energy, manufacturing solely in Australia, using only Australian-branded materials and employing, you guessed it, Australians only. Lastly, the Future Made in Australia policy is dedicated, according to Anthony, to support small businesses. We already know what Lay had to say about that. Now that we've explained the policy, it's time to explain why economists believe it might be an overambitious endeavour. Perhaps one that the Labour Party came up with in a hurry for damage control after their candidate fumbled the unemployment question. When former Prime Minister John Howard called the proposal overambitious, Jim Chalmers claimed that he was speaking as someone who was from a different era. But Danielle Wood, the Productivity Commissioner, is not only from this era, but she was also handpicked by Chalmers for the role. And yet she's also unconvinced that the Future Made in Australia policy has been well thought out. During an episode of Insiders on Backgrounds podcast, Woods claimed that some of the policy goals didn't make sense. When asked if the Labour Party was fetishizing manufacturing, Woods claimed that it might be the case. Namely, Anthony's policy revolves around setting the groundwork for a net zero future, where Australia is wholly self-reliant. To do so, however, and reach the Future Made in Australia goals by 2050, taxpayers would have to invest in 2024. And that's something Woods questions. Do they really have to? When asked if it was a bad thing per se that Australia relied on China for raw goods and manufacturing materials, the Productivity Commissioner said not as bad as the government has made it seem. Maybe Anthony should have repositioned himself to only importing from friends and allies. However, importing cheap goods is never a bad idea. Anthony's goals are clear. Australia should only rely on itself for everything. This idea stemmed from how other global leaders are working toward the same goals. However, Woods was cautious when she pointed out that the Australian economy needed to rebuild itself before competing with key players on an international scale. She also pointed out that in the meanwhile, the country could make do with resources from said global leaders to cut down its own costs as well. In the end, is raising taxes really necessary when the cost of living has gone up since Anthony assumed office? To give you some more context, the unemployment rate in January 2024 shot up to 4.1%, the first time since January 2022, before Anthony assumed office, to get to 4%. Between the back and forth between the Labour Party and the Liberal Nationals, the question remains unanswered. Are Aussie workers happy? If you were to rephrase this question and ask if Anthony's premiership is thriving, you'd get a different answer each time. Netizens have answered this question differently each time. Some believe that Anthony is incompetent, while others argue that the LNP set him up for failure with their frivolous spending. In the end, it depends on who you support. However, if the question was simply, are you happy given current economic trends in the country? Most people would reply with a resounding, no, not at all. That has a lot to do with the cost of living crisis and Australia's near-recession states. To clarify, Australia is not in an active recession, even though it is struggling. To qualify for recession, it would have to see numbers that reflect a downturn over 2 fiscal terms. That hasn't happened yet. That still doesn't mean that the economy isn't struggling and that the average worker isn't suffering. Lay was quick to point out the insolvency crisis and point the finger at Anthony. Meanwhile, the Labour Party believes that the previous LNP government set them up for failure with inherited debt. The term being used in Australian politics is economic vandalism. The term refers to deliberate actions taken to damage the country's economy, often politically motivated ones. They include policies that undermine economic stability, growth, or public trust. Economic vandalism can have severe consequences, such as reduced foreign investment, lower GDP, increased unemployment, and overall economic decline. It undermines a nation's ability to function effectively and can lead to long-term socio-economic damage. For example, implementing policies that harm businesses or industries, such as excessive taxation, unnecessary regulations, or trade barriers. Damaging key infrastructure like transportation, communication, or energy networks disrupts economic activities. Policies or practices harm the environment, leading to long-term economic costs in health, agriculture, and tourism sectors, and spreading false information that causes panic, reduces consumer confidence, or manipulates markets. While the Labour Party and the Liberal National Party are busy bouncing the blame off one another, the average Aussie is stuck in the crossfire. According to the University of Melbourne, almost half of the country's population cannot survive in the current economic times. Again, this is still an economy not in active recession. To be fair, the University of Melbourne estimates that it was 56%. More than half of the population had dipped or nearly depleted their savings trying to make ends meet. The 2023 research showed the real face of economic struggles faced by the average Australian, caught in the crossfire between the LP and the LNP. The current government will tell you that things might seem bad, but change is on the way. The opposition, meanwhile, will tell you that Anthony's governance has outright failed. The only ramification now is to replace him. But what do the actual numbers reflect? Is there an end in sight? For that, we'll have to make use of the research data and findings by the University of Melbourne. The research began in 2022, in which Australians were surveyed on their ability to afford essential items, simply food, energy, health, and housing. The term financial insecurity was used to define any difficulty in footing the bill for said essential items. The findings indicated that singles with children, young adults, those with high mental distress, and underemployed individuals faced the highest financial challenges. Notably, 84% of single parents experienced financial difficulties. Many Australians, especially in states like the Northern Territory and Western Australia, were struggling with the cost of living crisis, which severely impacts single-parent families. Another term that came up was food insecurity. That is, the inability to meet food requirements or the inability to pay for your grocery runs. The numbers showed that 60% of Australians faced food insecurity. The next question focused on financial resilience. It was discovered that while 69% of Australians could cover an unexpected $3,000 Australian dollar expense using savings, 9% couldn't cover it at all. Young people were particularly vulnerable, with only 56% able to use savings compared to 74% of those over 55. And then, 45% of those struggling with housing and 20% with food or energy bills claimed they didn't know how they'd be prepared for any unexpected expenses. Along with the grim reality, the researchers concluded with a way forward, a way out of the financial insecurity: cooperation. Addressing this crisis is crucial, perhaps now more so than ever. Providing immediate support like grocery vouchers and focusing on early intervention can prevent more Australians from falling into poverty. Collaboration between governments and service providers is essential to reduce financial vulnerability and promote financial resilience. Is there a way out for the average struggling Aussie?